The night was colder than it had any right to be, the kind of cold that didn't just bite at your skin, but crept deeper, settling into your bones like it intended to stay. The wind dragged across the empty plains, carrying dust and loneliness with it, and every now and then it rattled the loose boards of the small cabin, sitting far from anything that could be called town. Inside that cabin, a fire burned low, steady, but not warm enough to chase away everything. Jacob Hale sat in a worn wooden chair near the hearth, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the flames as if they held answers he had long since stopped asking for. He had chosen this place for a reason. Out here there were no questions, no memories he couldn't outrun, no people to remind him of the man he used to be. The silence was easier. It always was. Until that knock came. At first it was so faint he thought he imagined it, just another trick of the wind against old wood. But then it came again, sharper, this time deliberate. Jacob's head lifted slowly, his body going still. Every instinct told him to ignore it. No one came this far out, not at this hour. And if they did, it was rarely for anything good. The knock came a third time, weaker now, as if whoever stood outside didn't have much strength left. Jacob exhaled sharply, standing up with reluctance more than urgency. He moved toward the door, each step slow, measured, his hand hovering over the handle for a moment before finally pulling it open. The wind rushed in immediately, cold and unforgiving, and with it came the sight of her. She stood there, barely steady, wrapped in a thin, worn shawl, dust clinging to the hem of her dress, her face pale from the cold, but her eyes held something stronger than fear. They held desperation, and something else too, something that refused to break. "May I warm up by your fire?" she whispered. Her voice was soft, fragile, like it might shatter if the wind pushed too hard. Jacob stared at her longer than he should have, taking in every detail, every sign that told him this was trouble. He didn't need trouble. He had spent years making sure it never found him out here. And yet she stood on his doorstep in the middle of the night, looking like the storm itself had delivered her there. He tightened his grip on the door. "You shouldn't be out here." It wasn't an answer. She swayed slightly, her hand catching the frame to steady herself. "I know," she said quietly. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." Something in the way she said it, not pleading, not begging, just honest, made it harder to close the door. Jacob's jaw flexed, his instincts pulling him in two directions. One said send her away before whatever followed her reached his doorstep. The other was quieter but heavier. Leave her out there and she won't make it till morning. He stepped back abruptly, the decision made before he could argue with it. "Get inside." She didn't hesitate, stepping past him quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind. The warmth of the fire hit her immediately, though it was faint, and she let out a small breath like she had been holding it for miles. Jacob shut the door behind her, blocking out the wind again, but the quiet that followed felt different, now no longer empty. She stood near the fire, her hands held out toward the flames, her fingers trembling slightly as the warmth began to return. Jacob stayed by the door, watching her carefully. "Name?" he asked. She glanced back at him. "Lena." "Just Lena?" A faint, tired smile touched her lips. "That's all I have left." He didn't press further, though the answer raised more questions than it settled. He moved past her, grabbing an extra blanket from a nearby shelf and tossing it toward her. She caught it quickly, wrapping it around her shoulders with a soft murmur of thanks. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked softly, filling the silence between them. Jacob returned to his chair, though he didn't sit immediately, his eyes still on her, measuring, weighing. She looked out of place here, too fragile for a place like this, and yet there was something in the way she held herself, something stubborn that suggested she had made it this far on more than luck. "You running from something?" he asked finally. Lena stiffened just slightly, the blanket tightening around her. "Aren't we all?" she replied. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Not everyone ends up on my doorstep in the middle of the night." She didn't answer that, instead turning back to the fire, as if the flames were easier to face than him. Jacob watched her a moment longer, then finally sat down, the wood creaking under his weight. "You can stay till morning," he said gruffly. "After that, you move on." There it was, clear, simple, no attachments. Lena nodded slowly. "I understand," but something in her voice suggested she didn't expect more anyway. Time passed slowly, the fire burning lower, then higher, as Jacob added wood without thinking. Lena sat on the floor near the hearth, the blanket wrapped tightly around her, her eyes growing heavier with each passing minute, until finally she drifted into sleep right there, exhaustion pulling her under without warning. Jacob noticed. He always noticed everything. He leaned back in his chair, studying her sleeping form. She looked different now, less guarded, younger, almost peaceful if not for the faint lines of worry that still lingered on her face. He told himself it didn't matter. She was a stranger, a passing moment. By morning she would be gone, just like everything else he had learned not to hold on to. But as the wind howled outside and the fire flickered, casting shadows across the room, something unfamiliar settled in his chest. It had been a long time since there had been another person in this cabin. A long time since silence had been broken by anything other than his own thoughts. He didn't like how easily it shifted because of her. He didn't like how the thought of her leaving at dawn didn't sit as comfortably as it should have. The night dragged on, and at some point exhaustion pulled him into a light, restless sleep in the chair. When he woke, the fire had burned low again, and the first faint light of dawn crept through the window. For a moment he didn't move. Then he looked toward the hearth. Lena was gone. The blanket lay folded neatly where she had slept, the space already cold. Jacob stood quickly, a strange tightness in his chest as his gaze snapped toward the door. It was slightly open. The cold morning air slipping in told him everything. He moved fast, stepping outside, the chill hitting him hard, but he barely noticed. He scanned the empty land until he saw her. A small figure in the distance, walking away into the endless stretch of nothingness. Her steps slow, unsteady, but determined. Jacob clenched his jaw, something sharp cutting through him before he could stop it. He had told her to leave. He had made it clear. And yet, watching her walk away like that, alone into a world that had already proven it didn't care whether she survived or not, didn't sit right. Not anymore. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration building as he took a step forward, then stopped. What was he doing? This wasn't his problem. She wasn't his responsibility. He could turn around, go back inside, let the silence return, and pretend none of this happened. But his feet didn't move. Instead, he watched her stumble slightly, catching herself before continuing on, as if sheer willpower was the only thing keeping her upright. Jacob exhaled sharply under his breath. This was exactly why he stayed alone. No complications, no choices like this. And yet here he was, making one anyway. "Damn it," he muttered before striding forward, his voice cutting through the cold morning air. "Hey!" Lena stopped slowly, turning her expression surprised as he approached her, closing the distance between them quickly. She looked at him confused, a little wary. "I thought you said—" "I did," he cut in, his tone rough, but something else underneath it. "But I didn't say you had to walk out there half dead." She blinked, caught off guard by the edge in his voice. "I'll manage." He shook his head firmly. "No, you won't." Silence stretched between them, the wind tugging at her shawl again, as if trying to pull her back into the cold. Jacob looked at her for a long moment, then said something that even he hadn't planned until it left his mouth. "Come back." Lena's breath caught slightly. "What?" "Come back to the cabin," he said more firmly now. "At least until you can actually stand without looking like you'll fall over." She searched his face, trying to understand why he had changed his mind. Why? The same question from the night before. And again, he didn't have a simple answer. But this time he didn't hide behind distance either. He met her gaze directly. Because leaving you like this, he paused, then finished quieter, would be the kind of thing I'd regret. That changed something in her expression. Not fully trust, not yet, but something close. Something that made her hesitate instead of turning away immediately. Jacob extended his hand, not forcing, just offering. It's just a fire and a roof, that's all. Lena looked at his hand, then back at him, the decision clear in her eyes before she even spoke. She placed her hand in his. And just like that, everything shifted again, neither of them realizing that this simple moment, this small choice, would change both their lives in ways neither of them were ready for. Jacob didn't let go of her hand as they walked back toward the cabin, not because she couldn't walk, but because something in him refused to risk her slipping away again. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the last bite of night with it, but this time it didn't feel as empty. When they reached the door, he pushed it open, guiding her inside before the cold could follow too deeply. The fire had nearly died down, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. Jacob moved quickly, adding wood, striking a spark until the flames rose again, filling the room with warmth. Lena stood near the doorway, watching him quietly, her fingers still tingling from the brief warmth of his hand. When the fire caught fully, he stepped back, glancing at her. Sit. It wasn't harsh, just simple. She obeyed, lowering herself carefully near the hearth, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders again. Jacob poured water into a tin cup, warming it slightly before handing it to her. She accepted it with a soft, "Thank you," her voice steadier now but still carrying traces of exhaustion. For a while neither spoke again, but this silence felt different than before. It wasn't guarded, it wasn't heavy, it was uncertain but shared. Jacob leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, though his posture lacked its usual hardness. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said after a moment, "but you don't end up out here without a reason." Lena stared into the cup, the steam rising faintly before answering. "Some people don't like when you refuse to belong to them." Jacob's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. The meaning was clear enough. "They'll come looking?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Maybe. And if they do?" She lifted her gaze, meeting his. "Then I'll leave before they find me here." Something in his expression shifted at that. Not anger, not exactly, but close to it. "That's not how this works." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Jacob pushed off the wall, stepping closer, his voice lower, firmer. "I mean, you don't get to decide that alone." Lena blinked, caught off guard. "It's not your problem. It is if it comes to my door." Their eyes locked, tension flickering again, but not the same as before. This wasn't distance. This was something else, something stronger. "I won't drag you into trouble," she said quietly. Jacob shook his head once. "Too late for that." Silence followed, but it didn't break them apart this time. If anything, it pulled them into the same space, both standing on uncertain ground, but no longer on opposite sides. Days passed slowly but steadily. Lena stayed, not because she asked, not because he insisted, but because neither of them spoke about her leaving again. She helped where she could, small things at first, cleaning, tending the fire, cooking simple meals from what little Jacob had. She moved through the cabin like she was careful not to take up too much space, but the truth was she changed it just by being there. The silence wasn't the same anymore. It had warmth, now, life. Jacob noticed everything, even when he pretended not to. He noticed how she hummed softly when she thought he wasn't listening, how she fixed things without being asked, how she looked at the open land sometimes, like it still held shadows behind it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in deep orange, Lena stood outside near the fence, staring into the distance. Jacob approached slowly, stopping beside her. "You thinking about leaving again?" he asked. She shook her head slightly. "No." He glanced at her. "Then what?" She took a slow breath. "Just wondering how far I'd have made it if you hadn't opened that door." Jacob didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "Not far." She gave a small, sad smile. "Yeah, I figured." Another silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked suddenly. Jacob's gaze shifted to the horizon. "All the time." "Then why don't you?" He let out a quiet breath. "Because it's easier to stay than figure out where else to go." Lena nodded, understanding more than he expected. They stood there a while longer until the light faded and the cold crept back in. That night, as the fire burned steady inside the cabin, Lena sat across from him, her expression more serious than usual. "If they come," she started. Jacob looked up immediately. "They won't." "You don't know that." "I know enough." His voice held a quiet certainty that made her pause. "Why would you risk that?" she asked softly. Jacob leaned back slightly, his eyes on hers. "Because some things are worth the trouble." The words settled between them, heavy and real. Lena's breath caught slightly, her gaze dropping for a moment before returning to his. "You barely know me." "Maybe," he admitted, "but I know what it looks like when someone's been pushed too far." That struck something deep in her, something she had kept buried for too long. The room felt smaller, the air warmer, the distance between them no longer as wide as before. Time moved forward, carrying them with it in ways neither tried to stop. They fell into a rhythm, quiet but steady, shared meals, shared work, shared silence that no longer felt empty. It felt right. Then one night the past finally caught up. The sound of horses broke through the stillness, sharp and unmistakable. Jacob's head snapped up instantly, every instinct alert. Lena froze, the color draining from her face. "They found me." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Jacob stood, already moving toward the door, his expression hard in a way she hadn't seen before. "Stay inside." She grabbed his arm before he could step out. "No, you don't understand." "I understand enough," he cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're not facing them alone." Words echoed louder than anything else in the room. She stared at him, something shifting deep in her chest. "Why?" she asked again, this time not out of doubt, but something else, something closer to disbelief. Jacob looked at her, his voice quieter now, but stronger than ever. "Because you're not alone anymore." That was it. That was the moment everything changed for her. Not the fire, not the shelter, not even his help. It was those words. The door opened and the cold night rushed in along with the sound of approaching riders. But this time Lena didn't feel that same fear clawing at her chest. She stood behind him, not hiding, but not running either. Jacob stepped forward into the darkness, his stance firm, unyielding. The men pulled up in front of the cabin, their presence heavy with intent. One of them spoke, his voice sharp. "We're looking for a woman. She came this way." Jacob didn't hesitate. "No one here but me." The man's eyes narrowed, glancing past him toward the cabin. "Mind if we check?" Jacob's expression didn't change. "Yeah, I do." Silence stretched, the tension thick enough to cut. The wind howled again like it had the night she arrived. But this time it didn't feel the same. Because this time she wasn't standing outside alone in it. After a long moment the man scoffed, turning his horse. "This ain't over." Jacob didn't move until they were gone, their figures disappearing into the darkness. Once the sound of hooves faded, he stepped back inside, closing the door firmly behind him. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. Lena stood there staring at him, her eyes wide, not with fear, but something deeper. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Jacob shrugged slightly, though his gaze stayed on her. "Yeah, I did. She took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper now. Why? He looked at her, really looked this time. No walls, no distance, no hesitation. Because the night you knocked on my door, he paused, then finished quietly. Everything changed. Her breath caught again, the weight of those words settling into her heart. And for the first time since she had started running, she felt something she thought she had lost a long time ago. She felt safe. The fire crackled softly between them, the warmth, steady, constant, no longer just something to survive by, but something to live with. And this time, when the night deepened and the world outside turned cold again, neither of them stood alone in it anymore. Because one simple question whispered in the dark had led to something neither of them had expected. A place to stay, and someone who finally chose not to walk away.